Welcome back to Cultivate Talk. Today's conversation is about something we all do every day: tell stories, and how those stories shape the way we understand science, especially when the topics feel complex, controversial, or even polarizing. I'm joined by Dr. Emma Bloomfield, an associate professor of communication studies at the University of Nevada, Las Vegas. Her work sits at the intersection of storytelling and science communication, with a focus on issues like climate change, vaccination, and evolution, topics that are often deeply connected to identity, values, and belief systems. In this episode, we explore why storytelling is such a powerful tool for communicating science, how identity influences the way people receive information, and what happens when facts alone aren't enough to bridge divides. If you've ever struggled to have conversations around difficult topics or wondered how to communicate in a way that truly resonates, this episode offers both insight and practical takeaways. Let's get into it. Dr. Emma Frances Bloomfield is an associate professor of communication studies at the University of Nevada, Las Vegas. She studies environmental and science communication, especially surrounding controversial topics such as climate change, evolution, and vaccination. She is the author of 2 books, Science v. Story: Narrative Strategies for Science Communicators, and Communication Strategies for Engaging Climate Skeptics, Religion, and the Environment. Thank you so much for being here today, Dr. Bloomfield. How are you doing?
Thank you so much for having me. It's really a pleasure. I'm doing great. How are you doing?
Awesome. I am doing well. Getting back, you are actually my first podcast in 2026. You are the first one. Yeah. So we are kicking off the new year very strongly. And I'm super excited to have you here to talk about your amazing work. So to kind of kick things off, you describe your work as sitting at the intersection of storytelling and science communication. How did you first become interested in this blend?
I first thought of myself as a science communication and environmental communication scholar. When I was in graduate school, I became really interested in science and the environment as just really interesting topics that people communicate about in their everyday lives and have really impactful consequences. So I focused a lot in graduate school specifically on how people negotiate scientific and religious beliefs. So that ended up being my first book, the title which you read, about communication strategies for engaging climate skeptics, and I was specifically looking at religious climate skeptics. And I turned the dissertation into that first book, where I paired some of the textual analysis with interviews that I had conducted. And those interviews are really where that blend of science and storytelling emerged for me. So many people I spoke to about the environment would launch into stories about their childhood or about particular relationships or about formative moments. And the stories were the vehicle for telling me about how they were making meaning about the environment. But it occurred to me also that the story itself was also very powerful and persuasive when people would retell it or associate that story with their environmental beliefs. So then I began to dive more deeply into how storytelling is an integral part of all communication, including how we think about science. And that was the springboard, sort of turning the first book into that second book. I like to think of science and stories as being at an intersection, because oftentimes people view them as separate practices or even competing practices, right? We think of stories as fictional, something that's made up, and science is true and accurate and, and fact-based or objective. But I like to view them as really collaborative, side-by-side practices.
Fascinating. I love that. And so what draws you to studying controversial or polarized topics like climate change and vaccination and evolution?
I think I've always been fascinated with how people make decisions, especially in today's world where we have access to so much information from so many different perspectives. So how are people weighing different options? How are they communicating the information they're coming across? And what are they ultimately deciding? I think that's where real conflict emerges and kind of where real gravity emerges. Without stakes or consequences or uncertainty. We're just communicating everything we all agree on. So I'm kind of drawn to those areas of disagreement and conflict. Controversies like climate change and vaccination in particular have a lot of weight to them. decisions we make about vaccinating or about our health, can affect public health and well-being. What we decide to do about the environment, could change our entire world. So I think I'm drawn to topics like that. They also intersect more than just science. Of course, science plays an
Right.
important role, but topics like climate change and vaccination intersect people's faiths, their identities, their values, their culture, their politics. And I think I like that. I'm drawn to that messiness and that difficulty that people are trying to navigate when they're trying to, yeah, make environmentally friendly choices, or they're trying to decide whether they're going to vaccinate or not.
Yeah. And I find it really admirable your ability to commit to like that type of confrontation, because I think a lot of people, I think maybe not more so currently, but a lot of people try to avoid confrontation, whether that's relationally or with certain topics such as these that you study. So I think it takes a great deal of commitment and strength to like be able to just like take those on like head on and be able to ask the questions, ask for the stories, like get people to talk to you about these certain topics. And I can only imagine like the conflict that you have been faced with like directly, as
Mm-hmm.
well as like probably all the stories that you hear just have to be incredibly interesting.
Yeah, I think you're exactly right that a lot of people try to avoid conflict.
Right.
And conflict has a negative valence for sure. We want to
Yeah.
not be in conflict all the time. But for me, conflict doesn't necessarily mean aggression, right? Or being adversaries. It means, hey, there's disagreement here, there's different perspectives, there's an opportunity to get on the same page or find common ground. I think through conflict is where we really grow. And create new opportunities. So I try not to think of conflict when I teach it or when I
Yeah.
write about it. I try not to think about it always as something that's negative, but something that gives us opportunities to connect with one another in new ways. But
Yeah.
I have definitely been, at the tail end of some conflict, hate mail or people not liking, what I'm writing. And that comes
Yeah.
from all sides, right? That comes from scientists upset that I'm giving too much airtime to science skeptics, and it comes from science skeptics, right, who feel that I'm um, too empathetic to the science and not their perspective. So it's difficult to navigate.
Interesting. Wow, the hate mail. That's probably like a whole another level of academia that a lot of people don't always think about.
I talk about it a little bit in my second book, Science versus
Yeah.
Story, because part of the reason why scientists are hesitant to engage in public conversation about their topics is they fear they might get some some detractors or some
Yeah.
retribution. So I address that a little bit, that I'm also familiar with that as a potential risk.
Interesting. So, kind of the good segue in terms of like all the stories that you hear, you've emphasized that storytelling is central to effective science communication.
Hmm.
What makes storytelling so powerful, especially with polarizing issues?
Yeah, this is a great question. I talk about it a lot in that second book. Maybe I'll just give you a few examples of some of the ways
Yeah.
that storytelling is powerful. Um, One of the primary ways research suggests is that storytelling breaks down our defensive barriers. So if we have an opinion on a topic and someone just comes at us with a lot of different science that says that we're wrong, we're going to immediately put up defensive barriers and not be open to that information. Researchers sometimes call it the backfire or the boomerang effect, where I'm going to actually double down on my previously held beliefs in the face of scientific information that says that I'm not correct. Stories, however, help us bypass that defensive mechanism to make us more open to new information. Oh, there's a story. I'm connecting with this character. It's not a threat to my beliefs and
Yeah.
my identities. So when we use storytelling, we can get more information across to people than with science directly. For example, um, stories can also make abstract topics more accessible. I think climate change is a good example of that. It's hard to visualize climate change or understand all the components of climate change because it happens differently all around the world and affects
Right.
people differently. So instead of talking about high level science, about changing climates or 2 degrees Celsius warming, a specific story about how people are being impacted can help humanize and concretize that information. Um, Relatedly, stories are easier for people to remember and rate and retain information from. Stories are oftentimes more interesting and engaging than just scientific information. So I'm going to pay attention to that story more, and then I'm going to remember it and be able to recall it more easily as well. The literature sometimes calls it being transported by a story, right? So you're sort of
Mhm.
in the story, you're connecting with the story, and that can help us remember that information when we want to recall it later or when we need to make a decision.
Yeah, absolutely. So like in and especially in your research focus, but kind of in all of communication, I am always continuously fascinated by the power of storytelling. And I think kind of depending on what you research and what you teach, it looks a little differently in terms of what stories you're telling and sharing. But
Yes.
I've seen it be so powerful in so many different situations and contexts within research and within teaching as well, that I think from this science communication standpoint, where you're talking about these polarizing topics and things that people don't necessarily meet or are super welcoming to, I can only imagine that storytelling becomes even more powerful because, like you said, like those defense mechanisms do come down and you're able to kind of just listen and listen to the story for what it is while making those important connections.
Yeah, I think we oftentimes immediately recognize the power of stories as being educational, right? Children's
Right.
TV, right, is very story based. You know, we think about entertainment education as ways to connect with people in the classroom. But suddenly, when we start talking about science, sometimes people get a little cagey, right, about using stories as a way to communicate that information.
Yeah. So, how do you see personal identity shaping the way people tell or receive stories about scientific topics?
I would say personal identity and group identity is hugely important. Um, the religion people ascribe to, the politics that they follow, the
Mm.
culture that they're in, all of the personal experiences they have, all of those are going to affect how they consume scientific information, what information they seek out, how they process it, how they respond to it. We become socialized into our scientific beliefs, which means we're not only taking in educational information about science, you know, from a museum or from a classroom, but also from our family members, from our friends, from our social groups. For example, someone who's had a negative personal interaction with a doctor might lead them to be skeptical of, you know, medical systems or medical organizations writ large. Or maybe you know someone who you feel has been saved by some kind of alternative medical practice, and you want to pursue that instead of more traditional medical intervention. Those personal experiences create stories that are incredibly powerful, incredibly emotional. They're oftentimes really detailed, and they're
Hmm.
tailored to the values of that individual.
Yeah.
In my second book, I call those micro stories because they're very personal. They hit on those sort of minute details. Whereas science's stories tend to be macro stories. They're really big, they're generalizable, they're about the entire population. And that sometimes fails to connect with people in ways that those personal identity stories, you know, really connect.
Yeah.
Um, I'm very interested in identity as a current research trajectory. I have a forthcoming book with Cambridge called Mothers as Science Storytellers. And so that specifically focuses on how mothers are gatekeepers of scientific knowledge and how the identity of being a mother changes the kinds of science you seek out, how you communicate about science, and of course the impact of science for your family structure. Um, a lot
That's
of, yeah.
fascinating. What inspired, like, not to kind of get off topic here a little bit, but like, I would love to hear more about like what motivated you or what inspired you to kind of come up with this concept and this idea for your third book or
Yeah, I would
fourth
say
book. Sorry, was it fourth?
it's the third, yeah.
Third book. Okay.
Yes, the I would say there's a research trajectory and then a personal trajectory.
Yeah.
So research wise, a lot of identities were popping up in Science versus Story. You know, people were seeing themselves as a Christian, and that was changing how they were thinking about the environment. Or people saw themselves as a Republican, and that was changing how they were following COVID-19 masking, right, policies. So
Right.
the topic of identities kept coming up as influencing how people were telling stories. So I wanted to talk more directly in the third book about the role of identity. And then when I was approached by Cambridge, I had recently had my son, Oliver. So I was thinking about, well, instead of just talking about identity writ large, is there a particular identity I could dive into? And being a new mom, I was in a bunch of Facebook groups about, mom
Yeah.
life and sharing strategies and tips. And there was a lot of anti-vaccine discourse in some of those groups. And so I was thinking, well, mothers are gatekeepers for a lot of people's access to medicine, health from an
Yeah.
early age. There's also a lot of advocacy groups for climate change done by mothers, because mothers are interested in a very particular way in leaving, right, a healthy earth for
Yeah.
future generations. So yeah, so research wise, and then personally, I started thinking about mothers as an identity that I could, uniquely comment on.
Absolutely. There's so much information for new moms and even mothers who with multiple children, like an abundance of groups, like even beyond Facebook, and
Yes.
so many apps and so many websites that
Mhm.
this topic comes up very often, especially like in my health comm class. It's kind of like that there's an abundant amount of information, not
Yeah.
even with just mothering, but like parenting in general and so many different other components related to health or science communication, that it's like, okay, there's that, like some people feel overstimulated by it, like there's this overabundance of it.
Yes.
And then some people find like their groups that they need for like support or that they need for information. And it becomes like such a part of like how you receive that information becomes such a part or speaks to such a part of your identity. So
Absolutely.
I think that is fascinating. And I love that there's like a personal connection there in conjunction with your research trajectory. That is amazing.
I think you've hit on a really important point, that your identity influences how you seek out scientific information, and then the scientific information you choose to consume can then also kind of inform and validate that identity. So it is that
Right.
echo chamber has a negative connotation, but it is that sort of self-fulfilling prophecy almost, right?
Right, absolutely. So, are there common mistakes well meaning communicators make when trying to convey science to skeptical or hesitant audiences?
I think the main mistake I see is people over relying on science. And I want to say that with a lot of caveats, because science is always super duper important and the information we communicate has to be scientifically accurate. But if you go into a conversation just armed with a lot of statistics, and you're not connecting with someone as a person or understanding why they might be skeptical of science, just hitting them with more science is really not going to help, right, the conversation.
Right.
It's going to lead to those boomerang or those backfire effects. So when I say don't rely on the science, or don't, focus too much on the science, I mean, are there other ways we can get to the heart of that topic that is going to connect more closely to the values and the priorities of that individual? So thinking about, what are their identities? What do they care about at this moment? And that's sometimes things that science can't really talk about directly. Science is not necessarily in the business of morals, or in the business of saving money, but that's what some people might be really concerned about or interested in. So instead of leading or emphasizing the science, I would think about humanizing the topic, asking questions of the person you're engaging with. Find a shared value or goal is a way to engage with someone that's going to avoid them getting defensive or shutting down, or just not wanting to talk about the topic in the future. I performed a study with a colleague of mine, Lynn Van Swol at the University of Wisconsin, Madison, and we had two conditions, just to briefly summarize. One condition, people were given information about climate change. It was just a news article about climate change. The other condition, people were given an icebreaker activity.
Okay.
And then they had to come together and reach a consensus about, in their own groups, about what to do about climate change. And we found that the groups who were given information about climate change were actually less equipped to tackle the consensus activity. Whereas the people in the study who had done the icebreaker activity were more willing to have more conversations about climate change. They reached consensus faster. They had a better time during the study. So it's oftentimes better just to connect with people interpersonally than try to just continuously fire hose with scientific information.
That is fascinating. And that element of connecting with people interpersonally versus just, like you said, fire hosing with information, I think is really fascinating, and one that I think is could be often overlooked when we think about science in general and science as a whole. So like on that notion of identity, like continuing that topic, like how can communicators navigate conversations when identity cues dominate the way people interpret information? Excuse me.
I think when identity comes into play, the whoever you're talking with is going to see that identity is incredibly important to themselves. So we need to lean into that and embrace that. I think trying to get people to reject their identities or get them to think about a topic in a different way might backfire, or it might just deny the personhood, right, of the individual. In that forthcoming book about motherhood, I talk about how specifically medical doctors, right, engaging in conversations with parents, like maybe in a pediatric office about vaccination, can talk about parents as really valuable, knowledge holders about their children. Doctors know medical information that works for a majority of people, or the general advice, right, about information. But parents can provide tailored and specific knowledge about their children's behavior or their preferences. So it's really more about marrying or complementing different areas of expertise than saying, well, mothers are not experts. They have to listen to doctors 100% of the time. So kind of giving them kind of separate arenas, but thinking of them as complementary, can help bring that identity into conversation and say that is meaningful, that is worthwhile on this topic, right? And then the doctor maybe has expertise on this topic, for example.
Yeah, absolutely. And kind of like another like segue, but like I find it interesting from the lens of like health comm, especially how doctors manage that balance of like kind of like what you were just saying, like interpersonally connecting with parents. And oftentimes those are like brand new moms or brand new parents, or parents who have like these really concrete set ideas, and then matching that connection that they've made or have hopefully successfully established with science and with their expertise and with the knowledge that they know, and it's kind of like their job to communicate. And so it's always fascinating to me, like that balance of like how are they able to successfully, and I imagine a lot of times unsuccessfully, manage that balance in order to like communicate the information they need to, when so much is
It's incredibly difficult, especially because we're oftentimes not teaching medical professionals, right, in medical school, interpersonal communication skills. We're oftentimes not teaching scientists, right, in college how to communicate this information. And yet we're expecting them to be perfect communicators who can always connect with people, right? So I do think there's a disconnect there between what we might expect a scientific or medical expert to be good at and what they're actually trained in. I'd also say it's really hard to understand what the mothers are going through until you go through it. I remember I've been studying vaccination, for quite a bit of time, but it wasn't until I was a mom and I had my son in the pediatrician's office and I saw them bring in all, the syringes. I thought, oh my goodness, It's hard, I think, for people to understand the gravity of these decisions being made until you have to make them yourself. I know that I've studied vaccination for a while, and I knew I was absolutely going to get my son fully vaccinated on the schedule. But it's another thing to be in the room and see them bring in all the syringes and have to hold your child down, and you think, oh my gosh, I get it now. I get why there are these fears. I get why people are concerned. It is a terrible thing, right, to have your child crying and have to get that medicine, even though I know it's the best thing for them. So I think having some of that, that empathy for people as well, is incredibly important for those different situations. Again, all the information they have to weigh, and that some of these choices are going to be difficult.
Yeah, absolutely. So your field probably became even more interesting with the height of the pandemic and kind of going through a pandemic. So have you seen shifts in how different groups engage with science post-COVID based on your research?
It's an interesting question because I oftentimes joke with my colleagues that if somebody wants to interview me, then things are probably not going well because my research is all about, people distrusting science. And COVID was a very interesting time for a lot of obviously scientists and science communicators because we sort of had an in real time example of decisions that people were making. When I pitched my second book to the press, I originally had 3 case studies: climate change, evolution, and vaccination. But I pitched it in March 2020. So they
Oh,
encouraged me to add a fourth COVID-19 example, as I was writing
yeah.
the book. So yeah, it was really interesting to see how the conversation shifted from lockdown policies and masking to then being about vaccination and all those different elements. But in terms of how people are engaging with science, I think that COVID really polarized politically the topic of vaccination in a way we hadn't seen prior to COVID. A
Right.
lot of conservatives and liberals pre-COVID were skeptical of vaccines. It was really a bipartisan scientific issue. Conservative anti-vaxxers, don't want the government necessarily to intervene in their health, while more liberal anti-vaxxers are concerned more about, ingredients, what's natural, avoiding certain
Yeah.
substances. But post-COVID, whether you got the vaccine, or post or during COVID, I guess, whether you got the vaccination really became almost like a political marker, right?
Right.
Of whether you're vaccinating or not, or whether you're masking or not. So it really brought politics and polarization into that topic in particular, which we'd seen in other scientific controversies, but not as much in vaccination. So I think that's really interesting, the way that COVID shifted a lot of conversations about the intersections between politics and medicine. And of course, that's happening a lot right now with RFK Jr. changing, right, a lot of the
Yeah.
government policies and guidelines. So we're seeing more of that interplay between science and politics than I think it was not as overt prior to COVID. I also see people turning to social media more, and I think that's a general trajectory, but it also upticked during COVID-19, where people are searching for, lots of different sources of information and news, and maybe rejecting more legacy media or official sources of information. So a lot of
Mhm.
people are getting scientific information now from influencers or from people they know, interpersonally online, and I think that's changing people's views of credibility, or how do you
Right.
validate or verify information, all that stuff that we would normally think of as kind of markers of, okay, I can trust this information.
Yeah, absolutely. And you bring up such a fascinating point with influencers because this is a conversation I find myself in fairly often is like, how are people getting their information and how is it complicating the general conversation around credibility and like where are we supposed to get information and like just the harm that's so easily done by, not like people who are not qualified on social media sharing and talking about such information and encouraging diagnoses that may not necessarily be appropriate for some people. And I'm sure that's like there's an equivalent to that like within science communication as well. It's like the scientific information being communicated, like what harm is being done by people, getting their information from a source that's not credible, like somebody on social media.
Absolutely. It's a really big problem. A lot of platforms don't have moderation or sort of
Right.
quality control. There's no way
Yeah,
to verify someone is who they say they are. Uh,
exactly.
Social media is really a double-edged sword because scientists can now make themselves more accessible and share
Right.
information, right, more easily. But again, like you say, there's other people who maybe shouldn't be or aren't really qualified to make certain claims that they do, can muddy the waters as well. So again, it just becomes this sort of fire hose of
Yeah.
information, and it's really hard to know who to trust or not. I'm reminded of a conversation I had with a climate skeptic for my first book, and they said, "Well, how do I know who to listen to? This person with a PhD says the Earth is warming, and there's this person I see with a PhD says it's not. How am I supposed to know, who's right or not?"
Right.
The general public oftentimes doesn't have the level of scientific knowledge to be able to discern, right, who's right or not. So they're going on, do I know this influencer, right? Are they reflecting my values, right?
Right.
And do I connect
So
with
true.
them? They're
Yeah,
making different
absolutely.
kinds of choices, yeah.
Absolutely. So what does being a better storyteller look like in everyday life? Not just for professionals, but for parents, teachers, coworkers, or community members?
I think, ironically, the best feature or the strongest feature of a good storyteller is a good storyteller listens.
Yeah.
I think a good storyteller is always open to new information, to interactions. A good storyteller cares about their audience and wants to know their values and priorities. They view stories as important meaning-making tools, and they want to make connections with other people. So I think listening is a really good practice for being a better storyteller, because then you can tailor information to that audience. You can really find common ground with them and connect to them as individuals. I think a lot of times we think about these conversations as being one-on-one, talking with a friend or family member. But if you post something on social media, that could reach a lot of people, and you can still care about your audience and still talk about values and priorities that people care about. Good storytellers should be open to alternatives. They're comfortable admitting when they don't know something and they need to do more research. And they want to try to use their stories to better society, right? Not just themselves. They're sort of in it for the public good, at least better science storytellers.
Yeah, I love that. And you mentioned this back in the beginning when we started talking briefly, but like what role does empathy play in science
Mm.
communication?
I think it's incredibly important. If you don't care about your audience, you're not going to be in a true dialogue with them. You're not going to be engaging them. Not all stories are going to work under all circumstances, so we really need to be empathetic to our audience's needs and values in any
Yeah.
given situation. I talk about it a lot in my second book. Is yes, the content of your story matters, but you also need to pay attention, to the audience and the situation, and those things are also going to influence the uptake of the information within your story. There's a great quotation by Kenneth Burke, who's a scholar of communication, and I'll paraphrase it, but he says something along the lines of, a philosopher might be interested in mathematical symbolism, but if he has a toothache, he's going to be more interested in dentistry, right? So it's
Yeah.
like, yes, you might think you know what someone wants, but you have to be thinking about, well, what's urgent? What's a priority? What do they care about in the moment? Maybe it is a toothache. Maybe they're about to, run out of money before their next paycheck. Maybe they have a child who's been diagnosed with something and it's confusing or new to them. And those are things that are going to be occupying people's minds. And we have to be empathetic, right, to those situations, and be empathetic that it is confusing, and
Yeah.
it's okay for people to not know everything, especially if they've not been trained, as a scientist or medical professional.
Yeah, absolutely. I love that. And then finally, what's one small shift listeners can make this week to become better communicators around tough topics?
I think there's a bunch of things people could do. Maybe a small one is to seek out and open yourself up to having those conversations. Because I think the only
Right.
way we get better about communicating about tough topics is to practice. So I would encourage people to make a small shift, maybe put yourself out there on social media, or touch base with a friend or family member. Just seek out an opportunity to talk about a topic, ask people about their opinions about things, and try to practice having those conversations. The lower stakes environments at first, maybe get
Yeah.
yourself comfortable, do some practicing, see what works, see what doesn't. Maybe you'll
Right.
learn something about yourself as well in the conversation.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a really good one, and it seems small, although I can already feel like the discomfort within me, so I can imagine other people feeling that same way. But I
Hmm.
love what you mentioned about kind of like at least getting out of your comfort zone, you might learn something about yourself, because I think that's like something we can walk away with, especially when we're thinking about confrontation and
Yeah.
dealing with tough topics that we otherwise would avoid or maybe not even mention, is that at the bare minimum, you're probably going to learn something about yourself and the way that you
Hmm.
communicate and the way that you receive information around these tough topics, that I think it's worth the experiment and it can actually be a really big growth opportunity.
We could be scientists in our science communication
Yes,
and experiment and see what works.
exactly.
Exactly.
And that's like super fun. So
Yeah.
I love that. And that does seem low stake. So that seems low stake. It seems safe and it seems totally doable. So, but thank you so much for being here today with me, Dr. Bloomfield. This is incredibly fascinating. I cannot wait to hear more and even read your third book. So I'm really excited for that. All of your work around these tough topics, but in addition to the role empathy plays as well as identity, is just so relevant and so important. But beyond all of that, it's incredibly fascinating. So I could probably talk to you for hours.
Well,
But
thank you so much. It
Yeah,
was lovely to
thank
be on
you.
here.
Thank you so much. And hopefully we talk soon about that book.
All right, sounds great.
Thank you.
And that concludes our conversation with Dr. Emma Bloomfield. What stands out to me is the reminder that communication isn't just about delivering information, it's about connection. The stories we tell, the way we listen, and the empathy we bring into conversations all shape whether we're able to engage across difference in meaningful ways. In a time when so many conversations around science and public issues feel polarized, this episode challenges us to think more intentionally about how we communicate, not just to inform, but to understand. As always, thank you for listening to Cultivate Talk. If this conversation resonated with you, be sure to follow the show and share it with someone who might find it helpful. Until then, keep cultivating conversations that matter.